120,000 warriors on horseback are shaking the ground as they march toward the city. To face them, the city has only 25,000 defenders, which means each one must fight against 5. The air is echoing with war cries. In this situation, what would your decision be? Run, surrender, or fight with a secret weapon no one has ever seen before? This is the true story of the most incredible upset in military history, and trust me, you won't believe how it ends. July 1572, the Crimean horde was coming. 120,000 elite riders, the best cavalry in the entire world. These warriors can shoot arrows while riding at full speed and hit their targets every single time. They've crushed armies from Poland to Persia, and now they're heading straight for Moscow, Russia's capital. Here's the terrifying part. Just 1 year ago, this same army burned Moscow to the ground. 80,000 people died or were kidnapped and sold as slaves. The largest city in Northern Europe burned for days. Only the Kremlin survived, surrounded by dead bodies and ruins everywhere you looked. Now they're back, and this time their leader, Devlet Giray, has an even darker plan. He wants to erase Russia from the map forever. Total extinction, no survivors. Russian spies bring terrible news. This army is the largest the horde has ever assembled. They even brought Turkish soldiers and cannons from the powerful Ottoman Empire. But here's what the horde doesn't know. One man has been waiting for this moment. He has built a trap that will turn the battlefield into a slaughterhouse. His name is Ivan IV, but history calls him Ivan the Terrible, and he's about to show the world why. To understand why this battle mattered so much, you need to know what Russia went through for over 200 years. In 1237, the Mongols swept into Russia like a plague. They destroyed every city they found. Kiev, the greatest Russian city, was reduced to piles of rubble. Vladimir, Moscow, all of them fell. The Mongols built pyramids made of human dead bodies just to send a message. But the conquest was just the beginning. The worst part was what came after, something called the yoke. For more than 2 centuries, Russian princes had to bow down and serve the Mongol Khan. Every single year, huge caravans loaded with gold, silver, furs and slaves traveled south to the Mongols. The tribute never stopped. And there was something even more horrible. The Mongols demanded that noble Russian families send their sons away as prisoners. These children grew up in the Khan's court, forced to forget their language, their religion, and their people. Many never came home. Those who did were broken shadows of who they used to be. This was the perfect strategy to crush a nation's spirit. The Mongols didn't just steal Russia's wealth, they stole Russia's future. Whenever a Russian prince dared to fight back, the Mongol response was immediate and apocalyptic. Their armies would appear and erase entire cities from existence. The message was crystal clear: resistance equals death. In 1480, something changed. Ivan III, our story's hero's grandfather, refused to pay tribute. The armies faced each other for weeks, but never fought. The Mongols finally left. Russia was technically free, except it wasn't really free, because although the Golden Horde broke apart, its descendants remained. The Khanate of Kazan, the Khanate of Astrakhan, and the most powerful of all, the Crimean Khanate. These descendants never forgot that Russia belonged to them. Ivan Vasilievich was born in 1530 into total chaos. His father died when he was 3 years old. His mother was probably poisoned when he was 8. The boy grew up in the Kremlin, surrounded by greedy nobles who ignored him, humiliated him, and treated him like he was worthless. But this boy never forgot any of it. When he turned 16 in 1547, Ivan did something nobody expected. He didn't just crown himself as Prince of Moscow, he crowned himself as Tsar of all Russia. Tsar, the Russian version of Caesar, the title of Roman emperors. Ivan claimed he was equal to any emperor in the world, and then he proved it with blood and fire. In 1552, Ivan personally led the siege of Kazan, a fortress city that had resisted all Russian attacks for decades. Ivan surrounded it with 100,000 men, dug tunnels under its walls, and filled those tunnels with gunpowder. When the explosives went off, the walls collapsed. Russian soldiers poured in. The massacre lasted for days. Ivan built St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow to celebrate that colorful domed building that's now the symbol of Russia. 4 years later, in 1556, Astrakhan fell too. Now Ivan controlled the entire Volga River, the most important trade route in Eastern Europe. Russia was no longer a collection of frightened little kingdoms. It was an empire on the rise. But success unleashed something dark inside Ivan. He had always been paranoid, always suspected everyone wanted to betray him. In 1560, when his beloved wife Anastasia died suddenly, Ivan became convinced the nobles had poisoned her. He was probably right. His response was terrifying. He created a force called the Oprichnina in 1565. 6,000 men dressed in black, riding black horses, carrying brooms and dogheads on their saddles. These symbols meant they would sweep away traitors and bite them to death. These men could torture, execute, and steal property from anyone. The terror they unleashed was indescribable. Ivan even killed people personally. But here's the thing about Ivan that people forget. Despite being a monster, he was brilliant. He established Russia's first printing press, reorganized the entire army, expanded Russian borders into Siberia, and most importantly, understood that technology and smart strategy could defeat larger armies. This understanding would be the key to surviving 1572. In spring 1571, Devlet assembled a massive army in Crimea, 40,000 elite riders plus Turkish troops. His goal was to prove Russia was still weak, that the Tsar could still be humiliated. Ivan knew the attack was coming. He deployed troops along the southern border, but made a fatal mistake. He trusted incompetent commanders and split his forces. When the horde attacked, they moved with lightning speed. They avoided the main Russian armies and rode straight toward Moscow. On May 24, 1571, the Tatars reached the edge of the capital. They set fire to the wooden buildings surrounding the Kremlin. The fire spread impossibly fast. Within hours, all of Moscow was a gigantic bonfire. The survivor stories were horrifying. Thousands died, burned alive, trapped in burning buildings. Thousands more were crushed in panic as crowds tried to flee. The Tatars hunted refugees like animals, capturing tens of thousands to sell as slaves. When the smoke finally cleared 3 days later, Moscow had ceased to exist. Only the stone Kremlin remained standing, a lonely island in a sea of black ashes. Rough estimates say 80,000 people died. Some historians think the number was much higher. Devlet Giray didn't try to occupy Moscow. He didn't need to. He had achieved his goal of proving the Tsar was powerless. He returned to Crimea loaded with treasure and tens of thousands of Russian slaves. Then Devlet sent a message to Ivan, a promise that would change history. Next year he would return, and this time he wouldn't leave until Russia was ashes and the Tsar was dead. Ivan was furious, humiliated, but most of all, trapped. He knew Devlet would keep his promise. He knew 1572 would be the year Russia either survived or died forever. So, here's the million-dollar question. How does an empire survive when its capital has been destroyed and the enemy promises to return with even more warriors? The answer involved one man and a revolutionary war machine. The winter of 1571 to 1572 was the longest in Russian memory. Moscow was a skeleton of ashes. People were starving, but in the Kremlin, Ivan didn't sleep. He spent nights studying maps and questioning spies. He knew Devlet's next attack wouldn't be a quick raid. It would be a war of extermination. Ivan knew he couldn't win a regular battle. His forces were too weak and too scared after the 1571 disaster. He needed something different. He needed a military miracle. Or better yet, he needed to turn the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. The first thing Ivan did was fire all the commanders who had failed. Some were publicly executed as a warning. Others were sent to monasteries, which was a polite way of getting rid of them permanently. The Tsar had no time for incompetence. To replace them, Ivan chose the most capable man he had, Prince Mikhail Vorotinsky. This veteran had spent years studying Mongol tactics because he'd been their prisoner when he was young. Vorotinsky knew the enemy from the inside. He knew how they thought, how they fought, and most importantly, how they could be defeated. Ivan gave Vorotinsky absolute authority. Every soldier, every ruble, every resource of the empire was now his. The message was clear: save Russia or we all die trying. Vorotinsky began with massive recruitment. He summoned all nobles who owed military service. He mobilized the Streltsy, Ivan's professional musketeers. He recruited peasants and gave them weapons. He hired Cossack mercenaries who hated the Tatars as much as any Russian. But the numbers were still terrible. Even with supreme effort, Vorotinsky could only gather between 20 and 25,000 men against 120,000. That's a ratio of almost 5 to 1. In an open battle on the flat steppes where Tatar cavalry could move freely, it would be a massacre. Vorotinsky needed to level the playing field, and he had exactly the tool to do it: the Gulyaye Gorod. This translates to walking city or mobile fortress. Now here's where things get really interesting. The Russians had used simple versions before, basically large wooden shields soldiers could carry for protection from arrows. But what Vorotinsky had in mind was something completely different, something revolutionary that nobody had tried before. Solid wooden walls 3 meters high, that's about 10 feet, built in sections. Each section had wheels or could be placed on sleds. The walls were reinforced with extra layers of wood and sometimes metal plates. But here's what made it truly revolutionary. The walls had narrow openings at different heights, designed specifically for muskets and small cannons. Carpenters worked day and night for months, building hundreds of these sections. When assembled, they formed a mobile wall that could protect thousands of soldiers. A fortress that could move wherever it was needed and change shape according to the terrain. Inside the Gulyaye Gorod, musketeers would be protected from Tatar arrows, the horde's main weapon. They could fire safely through the openings while staying protected. Small cannons called falconets could be mounted on raised platforms, giving them devastating firing angles. It was simple but brilliant. Turn a mobile army into a walking fortress. The Tatars were masters of mobile combat, surrounding enemies and hit-and-run attacks. But what happens when the enemy simply refuses to move, when it becomes a spiky hedgehog of wood and metal, impossible to surround? Vorotinsky had identified the fundamental weakness of nomadic cavalry. They needed space to maneuver. They needed enemies to panic, break ranks, and flee. Their entire strategy depended on mobility and psychological terror. The Gulyaye Gorod eliminated both advantages. But there was a problem. For the trap to work, they needed the Tatars to attack. They needed to make 120,000 riders charge the walls again and again until they bled to death, which meant choosing the perfect battlefield. Vorotinsky spent weeks studying the land south of Moscow. He needed a place that met several requirements simultaneously. First, it had to be on the natural invasion path from Crimea so the Tatars couldn't avoid it. Second, it needed terrain that limited enemy cavalry movement, like nearby forests, rivers, and hills. Third, it needed to be defensible but not obviously too strong, because if it looked impenetrable, Devlet would simply go around it. He found the perfect spot near the village of Molody, about 60 kilometers south of Moscow. The area was crossed by small rivers and streams. Dense forests were on the sides, and most importantly, a series of low hills offered excellent positions for artillery. Vorotinsky designed his trap with surgical precision. He would deploy soldiers who looked vulnerable to lure the Tatars in. When they attacked, these soldiers would slowly retreat toward Molody, drawing the enemy deeper and deeper. Then the main army with the Gulye-Gorod would reveal itself, cutting off retreat. The Tatars would find themselves trapped between the Pakra River behind them, forests on the sides, and a mobile fortress in front. They couldn't use their huge numbers. They couldn't surround the Russians. They'd have to attack head-on, again and again, against muskets and cannons. It would be a slaughter. But the plan depended on one critical thing. Russian soldiers had to maintain formation no matter what, because if the Gulye-Gorod broke, if the men panicked and ran, then none of this would matter. The horde would chase and shred them as always. Vorotinsky spent the last months obsessively training his troops. Endless drills of assembling the Gulye-Gorod, shooting practice, discipline exercises under stressful conditions. He made them memorize one simple rule. No matter how many Tatars come, no matter how terrifying their charges, stay inside the walls. Shoot, reload, shoot again. Vorotinsky understood something fundamental about war. Technology wins battles, but discipline wins wars. In early summer 1572, everything was ready. Troops were positioned. The Gulye-Gorod was assembled and tested. Scouts were stationed along the southern border, waiting for the first signs of invasion. Ivan visited the camp one last time before returning to Moscow. He walked among the soldiers, looking at the faces of men who knew many of them would die in the coming weeks. He told them something simple. Behind us is Moscow. Behind Moscow are our families. There is nowhere else to retreat. Here we stand. Here we fight. And here, with God's help, we will destroy the horde forever. There were no cheers. The men simply nodded. They knew what was coming. And then, at the end of July, the scouts returned, riding like demons. The message was brief and terrifying. The horde had crossed the border. 120,000 riders advanced north like a dark tide. The horde didn't know what awaited them. They came seeking another easy victory, another city in flames. Instead, they would find their grave. And you won't believe what happens next. Devlet Giray was no ordinary raider. He was the Khan of Crimea, direct descendant of Genghis Khan, and servant of the most powerful man in the world, Sultan Selim, the second of the Ottoman Empire. In his palace, Devlet considered himself the true heir of the Golden Horde with a historic mission: restore Mongol rule over Russia. Born around 1512, Devlet had spent decades building his power. He'd eliminated rivals, made alliances with the Ottomans, and turned Crimea into the richest state on the Black Sea. His main business was slave trade. Every year, tens of thousands of Slavic slaves passed through Crimean markets, captured in raids. This trade filled the Khan's treasure rooms with Ottoman gold. But Devlet wanted more than wealth. He wanted his name remembered alongside Batu Khan, the original conqueror of Russia, and after burning Moscow in 1571, he knew he was close to achieving it. The Ottoman Sultan had given his blessing and reinforcements: 4,000 elite janissaries, modern artillery, and military advisors. The message was clear. Constantinople supported the total destruction of Russia. If Devlet succeeded, the balance of power in Eastern Europe would change forever. Devlet was arrogant, but not stupid. He knew the Russians would try to defend themselves this time. That's why he'd assembled the largest army the horde had seen in generations. 120,000 warriors. For Devlet, this would be his masterpiece. He would crush any resistance, burn Moscow again, capture Ivan, and drag him in chains to Crimea. Then he'd install a puppet prince on the throne, and Russia would pay tribute again like the old days. It was a perfect plan, except for one detail. He completely underestimated his enemy. The army Devlet commanded was one of the most effective fighting forces of the 16th century. The Crimean Tatars had inherited centuries of Mongol military experience and perfected it with Ottoman technology. The core of the army were elite riders trained from childhood to ride and shoot arrows at the same time. Each warrior commanded his own group of tribal fighters, men who lived on horseback and considered war their only honorable job. The basic Tatar tactic was simple but devastatingly effective. Groups of mounted archers approached enemies at gallop, fired clouds of arrows, then withdrew before the enemy could respond. They repeated this again and again, wearing down opponents. When the enemy finally broke formation to chase them or collapsed from exhaustion, then came the killing blow, the massive heavy cavalry charge that tore through enemy lines. This strategy had worked against Polish, Lithuanian, Hungarian and Russian armies for centuries. European armies simply didn't know how to counter it. Their heavy knights were too slow. Their infantry couldn't maintain formation under constant arrow rain. And when they tried to hide in fortifications, the Tatars simply avoided them and raided the surrounding territory until they surrendered from starvation. In addition to Tatar cavalry, Devlet had Ottoman janissaries, professional infantry soldiers considered among the best in the world. Armed with state-of-the-art muskets and trained in iron discipline, the janissaries could maintain devastating firepower. Ottoman artillery, though not numerous, was technologically superior to anything the Russians had. The horde supply system was another crucial advantage. Unlike European armies that relied on slow, vulnerable supply trains, the Tatars traveled light. Each warrior carried dried meat, cheese, and fermented milk. Their horses ate grass on the march. They could cover 100 kilometers in a day, something impossible for any conventional army. And then there was the psychological factor. For centuries, the mere mention of the horde had been enough to sow panic. The Tatars worked hard to be known for their cruelty. They impaled prisoners on roads everyone could see, burned entire villages, and captured civilians to sell as slaves. This terror was as much a weapon as their swords. The numbers said it all. 120,000 experienced warriors backed by Ottoman technology, led by a Khan hungry for glory. Against this, the Russians could muster perhaps 25,000 men, many of them poorly trained peasants. In any rational military calculation, Russia had no chance. At the end of July 1572, the horde crossed the Don River and entered Russian territory. Devlet was in no hurry. He let his men raid border villages, capturing cattle and slaves. This served two purposes. It fed his army and sent waves of refugees north, spreading panic. Russian scouts watched from distant forests, counting banners and estimating numbers. The reports they sent to Vorotinsky were increasingly alarming. The horde was even larger than feared and coming straight along the main road to Moscow. Devlet was confident. His spies had told him the Russian army was small and concentrated near Molody. He would destroy them there, and then Moscow would be defenseless. On July 26th, the Tatar advance guard made contact with Russian scouting forces near the Oka River. There were brief fights. The Russians withdrew, apparently overwhelmed. Devlet smiled. Everything was going as expected. The next day, the main horde army crossed the Oka and camped on the north bank. Now, there were only 60 kilometers to Moscow. Devlet ordered a day of rest. He wanted his troops fresh for the battle he knew was coming. During the night, the horde's campfires lit the horizon like a city of lights. Russian soldiers watching from a distance felt their stomachs tighten. It was one thing to hear that 120,000 enemies were coming. It was quite another to see the glow of their fires stretching as far as the eye could see. On July 28th, the horde set out again. This time they encountered more organized resistance. Russian cavalry units harassed them, fired, and withdrew. The Tatars chased them, but the Russians refused to stand and fight. They simply vanished into the forests. Devlet was slightly irritated but not worried. This was exactly what Russians always did: delay, harass, wait for reinforcements that never came. Eventually they'd run out of space to retreat. What Devlet didn't know was that every kilometer he advanced put him deeper into Vorotinsky's trap. The Russians weren't delaying out of desperation. They were deliberately guiding the horde toward the slaughterhouse. On July 29th, Tatar scouts reported that the main Russian army was deployed near Molodi. Devlet commanded a complete search of the enemy. What his men saw confused them. The Russians put up a wooden defense, but it wasn't a real fort. Devlet consulted his commanders. Some suggested bypassing the position and marching straight to Moscow. But the Khan rejected the idea. He couldn't leave an intact Russian army behind him. Besides, it was just a small force hidden behind wood. His riders would simply surround it and burn it. He made the decision Vorotinsky had been praying for. He would attack Molodi with full force. He planned to defeat the Russians in open battle and then march proudly to Moscow. It was exactly what the Russians wanted. The trap was set, and what came next would be one of the most brutal bloodbaths of the 16th century. On July 30th, the morning came with a bright sky and unbearable heat. Russian soldiers had spent the night awake, listening to the distant rumble of 120,000 men and horses approaching. Now, with daylight, they could see them. The southern horizon had become a dark sea of movement. The sound of thousands of hooves pounding the earth was like constant thunder, vibrating the ground under the defenders' feet. Some Russian soldiers prayed, others held their guns with shaking hands. The veterans simply waited in silence with stone faces. Vorotinsky watched from a hill behind the Gulyai Gorod. His plan depended on staying calm and executing each phase with precision. He positioned 3,000 horsemen south of the main army. They had one job: attack the Tatars, cause losses, and then pull back to the wooden fortress. By mid-morning, the Tatar advance guard made contact, about 10,000 light riders, scouts, and mounted archers. They stopped about 500 meters from the Russian line, checking out the situation. Then, without warning, they charged. The Russian cavalry responded exactly as planned. Mounted musketeers fired a volley that knocked dozens of Tatars from their horses. Then they turned and galloped north toward the safety of the Gulyai Gorod. The Tatars chased them, sure this was another cowardly Russian retreat. Then they saw the mobile fortress up close for the first time. The wooden sections of the Gulyai Gorod stretched in a line almost 1 kilometer long, forming a continuous 3-meter-high barrier. Behind the walls, thousands of muskets pointed through the openings. At the corners and elevated points, small cannons were mounted on platforms. The entire structure was backed by the Pakra River, so it couldn't be attacked from behind. The Russian cavalry disappeared through gates in the wall that closed immediately behind them. The pursuing Tatars suddenly found themselves 100 meters from a fortress, bristling with firearms. Vorotinsky gave the order. The openings in the Gulyai Gorod erupted with fire and smoke. A storm of lead swept the Tatar riders. Men and horses fell in heaps. The survivors turned and fled in disorder, leaving more than 200 dead and wounded behind. It was a massive psychological shock. The Tatars had never seen anything like it. Their traditional hit-and-run tactics were useless against an enemy that simply refused to come out. And getting close meant entering a death zone where muskets shredded them. By afternoon, most of Devlet's army had arrived. The Khan rode forward to personally inspect the Russian position. What he saw filled him with frustration. The Russians had chosen their ground perfectly. Going around the fortress would mean crossing dense forests where cavalry couldn't maneuver. Attacking head-on would mean charging straight into a wall of fire. But Devlet had 120,000 men. He could afford casualties. He ordered a large-scale assault for the end of the day, using 10,000 riders in waves. He would overwhelm the Russian position with sheer numbers. The first wave attacked at dusk. Thousands of Tatar riders charged at full speed, firing arrows as they advanced. Arrows rained on the Gulye-Gorod, but most stuck harmlessly in the wooden walls. Some passed through openings, wounding or killing unlucky defenders. But the structure absorbed most of the punishment. When the attackers reached 50 meters, the Russian muskets opened fire. The first line of Tatars vanished in a cloud of smoke and blood. Those coming behind stumbled over the corpses of their friends and dead horses. Chaos was total. A second wave attacked, then a third. Each time, the result was the same. The Tatars couldn't close the distance. The few who managed to reach the walls found no way to climb them, while defenders fired downward. Some tried to set fire to the wood, but the sections were wet and reinforced, specifically designed to resist fire. When darkness fell, Devlet ordered a halt. He'd lost approximately 1,000 men and achieved absolutely nothing. The Russians, protected behind their walls, had suffered fewer than 100 casualties. That night, the Tatars camped in a circle around the Russian position at a safe distance. Campfires illuminated thousands of grim faces. Warriors who'd spent their entire lives on horseback, dominating battles with speed, now found themselves powerless before a wooden wall. Inside the Gulye-Gorod, the Russians worked frantically, repairing damaged sections, redistributing ammunition, and treating the wounded. Vorotinsky walked among the troops, congratulating them. The first day had been a huge success, but he knew the worst was yet to come. Devlet wouldn't withdraw. His pride, his reputation, everything was at stake. He would attack again, and next time he'd come with everything. The second day began with bombardment. Devlet had brought Ottoman artillery to the front during the night. A dozen bronze cannons, each capable of firing 6-kilogram iron balls. At 8 in the morning, they opened fire. The sound was deafening. Cannonballs whistled through the air and struck the Gulye-Gorod with impacts that shook the earth. Some pierced the wooden walls, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. An entire section collapsed when 3 balls hit it at once, killing a dozen men. But Vorotinsky had expected this. He'd reinforced critical sections with extra layers of wood and packed earth, and crucially, he'd positioned his own cannons to shoot back. The Russian gunners, though outnumbered, were accurate. They managed to destroy 2 Ottoman cannons and force the others to retreat. After 2 hours of bombardment, Devlet ordered the main assault. This time, it wouldn't be just riders. The Janissaries would go into action. 4,000 Ottoman infantry advanced in tight formation, muskets ready. Behind them came 20,000 Tatar riders waiting to exploit any breakthrough. The Janissaries advanced with professional discipline under intense fire. When they reached 100 meters, they stopped, formed lines, and fired their muskets at the Gulye-Gorod. It was the first time in the battle the Russians faced concentrated musket fire. Dozens of defenders fell riddled with Ottoman bullets. But the Russians had more muskets, far more. As the Janissaries reloaded, the defenders unleashed volley after volley. The Ottoman formation began to fall apart. Men dropped by the dozens. Officers shouted orders, trying to keep everyone together. But the slaughter was relentless. Then the Janissaries charged with bayonets. It was desperate but brave. Some managed to reach the walls and start climbing. For a few terrifying moments, it seemed they might break through. Vorotinsky responded by moving reserve troops to the threatened section. Russian soldiers fought hand-to-hand on top of the walls, pushing ladders away, stabbing downward with spears, firing muskets at point-blank range. The fight was savage and desperate. Then Russian cannons fired grapeshot directly into the Janissaries, clustered at the base of the walls. The effect was catastrophic. Hundreds of Ottomans were torn apart in seconds. The survivors broke and ran. The Tatar riders tried to take advantage of the confusion and charge, but found themselves riding straight into Russian fire without infantry support. It was a massacre. Corpses piled so high in front of certain wall sections that they blocked later attacks. By noon, Devlet had lost more than 3,000 men, including nearly 1,000 janissaries. The Russians had suffered about 400 casualties, but most importantly, the mobile fortress remained intact. Not a single section had broken. The Russians continued firing with the same deadly intensity. Devlet was furious, but also beginning to worry. He'd expected to crush the Russians in 1 or 2 days, but now, on the second day, his army was bleeding out while the Russians remained safe behind their walls. He ordered a complete encirclement. If he couldn't break the Gulye-Gorod with frontal attacks, he'd do it by starvation. He'd cut Russian supplies and force them to come out or die of hunger. That night, both commanders knew the next day would be critical. The third day brought scorching heat. The stench of thousands of corpses rotting under the sun was unbearable. Flies covered everything in black clouds. The wounded groaned in agony, but no one could stop. The battle continued. Devlet decided to change tactics. Mass attacks weren't working. Instead, he ordered continuous day and night attacks in rotation. He'd keep the Russians under constant pressure, giving them no rest. Eventually, exhaustion would break them. It began at dawn with an attack of 5,000 riders against the western side of the Gulye-Gorod. 2 hours later, another attack hit the eastern side, then the center, then the west again. The attacks never stopped. The moment one was pushed back, another began in a different spot. It was exhausting for the defenders. They couldn't lower their guard for a moment. They fired, reloaded, fired again until their shoulders were black with bruises. Their ears bled from constant noise. Their eyes burned from smoke. But Russian discipline held. Vorotinsky had organized a rotation system where fresh units replaced exhausted ones every few hours. Men could rest, eat, and sleep briefly before returning to the line. It wasn't ideal, but it worked. The Tatars, on the other hand, were beginning to suffer more serious problems. Morale was falling. Warriors who'd come expecting easy treasure and glory now saw only senseless death. Some commanders began openly questioning Devlet's strategy. Moreover, the horde's supplies were running out. An army of 120,000 men and horses eats massive amounts of food and water daily. They'd looted the area, but Vorotinsky had ordered all nearby villages evacuated weeks earlier. There was nothing to take. In mid-afternoon, Devlet ordered a final massive assault for the day. 20,000 riders would attack the center of the Gulye-Gorod at once, supported by the remaining janissaries. They'd break the Russian lines, or die trying. The charge was spectacular and terrifying. Thousands of Tatar riders galloped straight toward the walls, shouting war cries, firing arrows in black clouds. The janissaries advanced behind, firing coordinated volleys. Russian fire reached hellish levels. Muskets fired so fast the metal barrels became too hot to touch. Gunners loaded grapeshot into cannons and fired directly into the masses of attackers. The slaughter was indescribable. Hundreds of Tatars fell every minute. Horses, maddened by noise and the smell of blood, reared and threw their riders. The wounded were trampled by those coming behind. The ground in front of the Gulye-Gorod became a swamp of blood and mud. Some attackers managed to reach the walls. Desperate fights broke out at half a dozen points. Russian spears clashed against Tatar swords. Men fell from the walls pierced by weapons. Stones and boiling oil rained on the attackers. But the walls held. After an hour of brutal combat, the attackers retreated again, leaving more than 2,000 dead. When darkness fell on the third day, Devlet had lost approximately 6,000 men total. The Russians had lost around 800. The casualty ratio was catastrophic for the Tatars. But something had changed. The Russian soldiers who began the battle terrified now felt confident. They'd held for 3 days against the most feared force in the world. They'd killed thousands without being defeated. They began to believe they could win, and Vorotinsky knew it was time to shift from defense to offense. The trap had worked. The Tatars were bleeding. Now it was time to close the jaws and crush them completely. Stay with me, because what happens next is absolutely insane. The morning of the 4th day brought fog, thick, grey fog that reduced visibility to just a few meters. The Tatars, used to fighting on open steppes under clear skies, felt uneasy. They couldn't see the enemy, couldn't assess their movements. Vorotinsky had been waiting for exactly these conditions. He'd noticed the morning fog pattern in previous days. And now, with the horde preparing for its massive assault, it was the perfect time to strike first. At 5 in the morning, while most of the Tatar camp was still sleeping, the gates of the Gulye Gorod opened. 5,000 Russian soldiers emerged in absolute silence, divided into 10 columns of 500 men each. They were Vorotinsky's best troops, veteran musketeers, Don Cossacks, and armored nobles. The columns advanced through the fog like ghosts. Tatar guards didn't see them until too late. Russian bayonets struck silently, slitting sentries' throats before they could scream. Within minutes, the Russians were inside the camp. Then the massacre began. Russian muskets opened fire at point-blank range into tents full of sleeping warriors. The explosions woke the camp in total chaos. Half-naked men stumbled out of tents, searching for weapons, not understanding what was happening. The Russians killed them systematically, moving from tent to tent. The fog amplified the confusion. Tatars fired into shadows, frequently killing their own men. They couldn't organize, couldn't form defensive lines. It was guerrilla warfare in the heart of their own camp. One Russian column reached the horse corrals. They killed the guards, then shot the animals or scattered them in panic. Thousands of Tatar horses fled, galloping into the steppes, taking with them the mobility that was the heart of the horde's military power. Another column reached the Tatar supply train and set fire to food and ammunition wagons. Flames rose into the sky, visible even through the fog. Devlet, awakened by the chaos, desperately tried to organize a response. He gathered his personal guard, about 2,000 elite riders, and charged where he thought the Russians were. But in the fog, he simply galloped in circles while his men were killed around him. After 2 hours of chaotic combat, Vorotinsky sounded the retreat horn. The Russian columns pulled back to the Gulye Gorod, carrying prisoners, captured weapons, and Tatar banners as trophies. When the fog lifted at noon, Devlet could finally see the damage. It was catastrophic. Approximately 10,000 of his warriors lay dead, many killed while sleeping. Thousands of horses had disappeared. His supply train was destroyed, and worst of all, his army's morale was shattered. The Russians had lost fewer than 300 men in the raid. It was a brilliant tactical victory that completely changed the battle. The defenders had become attackers. The cornered Russians had burst out and struck the giant. But Devlet couldn't withdraw now, not after so much bloodshed. He ordered the massive assault to continue as planned. 50,000 warriors would attack that afternoon. Then news arrived that would change everything. Scouts reported dust columns to the north. A Russian reinforcement army was approaching. 5,000 men under Prince Dmitry Kvorostinin, an aggressive commander known for his boldness. Devlet now faced a strategic nightmare. If he launched his massive assault against the Gulye Gorod, he'd leave his back exposed to Russian reinforcements. But if he divided his forces to face Kvorostinin, he'd fatally weaken his main attack. He made what seemed like the sensible decision: divide his army. 30,000 would remain besieging the Gulye Gorod. The other 84,000 would march north to destroy the reinforcements before they could join Vorotinsky. It was exactly what the Russians wanted. Vorotinsky and Kvorostinin had coordinated this perfectly. The reinforcements weren't coming to hide in the Gulye Gorod. They were coming to be the hammer against the anvil. The seventh day began with Devlet leading 84,000 warriors north to intercept Kvorostinin. He engaged them 15 kilometers from Molodi in an area of rolling hills and scattered forests. Kvorostinin had chosen his position carefully. He deployed his 5,000 men on wooded hillsides with dense forest at his back, providing an escape route if needed. He had light cannons and enough muskets to make any attack costly. Devlet ordered an immediate attack. He was furious, frustrated, and making mistakes. He launched wave after wave of cavalry against Kvorostinin's position. The Russians shredded them with disciplined fire, yielding ground slowly but causing horrible casualties. Meanwhile at Molodi, Vorotinsky saw his opportunity. The 30,000 Tatars left besieging the Gulyai Gorod were too few to maintain an effective encirclement. He opened all the gates of the mobile fortress and launched his entire army against them. It was a wild, desperate charge. 20,000 Russian soldiers burst out shouting, firing muskets at point-blank range, striking with spears and swords. The Tatars, taken completely by surprise, broke ranks almost immediately. What followed was a relentless pursuit. The Russians took no prisoners. They hunted the retreating Tatars through forests and streams, killing anyone they could reach. The Cossacks were particularly merciless, remembering centuries of Tatar raids. Vorotinsky then did something bold to the point of recklessness. He left soldiers behind to protect the Gulyai Gorod and marched north with 15,000 men to join Kvorostinin. The trap was closing on Devlet. When the two Russian armies united in mid-afternoon, Devlet found himself in an impossible position. He was being attacked from two directions. His army, after days of non-stop combat, was exhausted. The horses were spent, supplies had run out, and now the Russians who were supposedly trapped were surrounding him. The Khan tried to organize an orderly retreat, but when an army of 100,000 begins to retreat, especially one that's lost confidence in its leader, retreat quickly becomes a stampede. And when panic sets in, stampede becomes slaughter. What happened in the following hours was one of the most spectacular bloodbaths of the 16th century. The Russians pursued the retreating horde for kilometers. Tatars on exhausted horses couldn't flee fast enough. Columns of fugitives became perfect targets for Russian muskets. Streams and rivers became deadly traps. Thousands of Tatars tried to cross the Pakra River at once. They pushed each other into the water. Many drowned under the weight of their armor. Those who managed to cross were shot down by musket fire from the opposite bank. The forests the Tatars hoped would provide cover became mazes of death. Cossacks, experts in forest combat, hunted them among the trees. Groups of Tatars surrendered only to be killed anyway. Russian thirst for revenge, for centuries of humiliation, had been unleashed, and it was unstoppable. Devlet, the proud Khan of Crimea, fled with barely 6,000 survivors of his personal guard. He abandoned his tent, his banners, his artillery, everything. His only concern was escaping alive. When darkness fell on the seventh day, the pursuit finally ended. Russian soldiers were too exhausted to continue, but the damage was done. The battlefield and surrounding areas were covered with between 30,000 and 40,000 Tatar corpses. Some historians think the actual number was even higher, possibly 50,000 or more, when counting those who died in following days from wounds. According to Russian records, the Pakra River flowed red with blood for days. Wolves and crows feasted for weeks. The stench was so terrible that villages within 15 kilometers had to be temporarily evacuated. The Crimean horde, the most feared military force in Eastern Europe, had been shattered. Of 120,000 warriors who'd confidently marched toward Moscow, fewer than 20,000 returned to Crimea. The rest lay dead in the fields around Molodi or had been captured. The Battle of Molodi was over, and with it, the Mongol threat to Russia was over forever. Devlet's escape was pathetic for a man who'd burned Moscow just 1 year earlier. The Khan, surrounded by the broken remains of his guard, rode day and night south. He didn't stop to eat or sleep. The terror of being captured by Russians kept him moving. Cossacks pursued him for days, hunting stragglers like wolves tracking wounded prey. Groups of exhausted Tatars on dying horses were overtaken and killed. Some tried to surrender, offering ransom, begging for mercy. They received none. The Cossacks remembered too many burned villages, too many enslaved families. When Devlet finally crossed the Don and reached safe territory, only between 10 and 15,000 men remained with him from an army of 120,000. That's a loss rate of 85 to 90%. In military terms, it wasn't just a defeat, it was an extermination. The wounded were abandoned on the road without medical supplies or transport. They were simply left to die on the steppes. Russian villagers who found these men showed no mercy. Captured prisoners faced different fates. Tatar nobles and Ottoman janissaries were taken to Moscow in chains. Ivan paraded them publicly through the streets as trophies. Some were executed in elaborate public ceremonies before celebrating crowds. Others were ransomed for huge sums that filled Russia's empty treasury. The captured plunder was massive: thousands of horses, hundreds of supply wagons, Ottoman artillery, weapons, armor, and war banners. The banners were hung in St. Basil's Cathedral as permanent reminders of the victory. Some are still preserved in Russian museums today. But the true treasure was intangible. The horde had been psychologically broken. The aura of invincibility that had terrified Eastern Europe for centuries evaporated in 7 days of carnage. When the first messengers reached Moscow with news of the victory, people simply didn't believe it. It seemed too good to be true. But when more messengers arrived, bringing captured banners and chained prisoners, reality sank in. Moscow erupted in celebrations. Church bells rang for days. Religious processions filled the streets. 3 days of national holiday were declared. Ivan ordered Thanksgiving services in every church in the country. He proclaimed the victory was proof of divine favor. God had chosen the Russians to defeat the Mongols. The Tsar generously rewarded Vorotinsky with lands and titles. Other commanders were also rewarded. Regular soldiers received cash bonuses and land. Many peasants who fought at Molody were freed as a reward. It was unprecedented. Commemorative churches were built in Molody and Moscow. One was constructed on the exact site where the Gulye Gorod had stood. It became a place of pilgrimage. News of Molody reached Constantinople like lightning. Sultan Selim was furious. He'd invested significant resources in Devlet's campaign: janissaries, artillery, advisors. All had been destroyed or captured. The captured janissaries, eventually ransomed, brought humiliating reports. They told how a wooden fortress had stopped the largest army Crimea had ever assembled, how Russian muskets had torn them apart, how their proud cavalry had been reduced to piles of corpses. Selim ordered a full investigation. Ottoman military reports concluded that Devlet had made fundamental tactical errors. But the most important conclusion was strategic. The era of dominant cavalry was over. Firearms and mobile fortifications had fundamentally changed warfare. The Ottomans needed to adapt or face similar defeats. Ottoman support for Crimea was drastically reduced after Molody. Devlet received a cold letter from the Sultan, basically blaming him for the disaster and warning he shouldn't expect more help. The Khan spent the rest of his reign trying to rebuild his army. He never regained his former strength. Throughout Eastern Europe, the balance of power shifted. Poland and Lithuania, which had lived in constant fear of Tatar raids, saw the monster could be defeated. They began adopting similar tactics. Venetian and Genoese merchants on the Black Sea reported slave prices skyrocketed because Tatar raids had almost completely stopped. The source of slaves that had fed Mediterranean markets for centuries had suddenly dried up. Russian diplomacy was transformed. European embassies in Moscow began treating Ivan with new respect. He was no longer the ruler of some barbaric kingdom. He was the Tsar who broke the horde, someone who could be a valuable ally or a dangerous enemy. England, in particular, sought closer relations. English military advisors arrived to study the Goulier-Gorod. Molody had announced Russia was a major European power, no longer to be ignored. Molody wasn't simply a battle, it was the end point of an era that had lasted almost 3.5 centuries. Since Batu Khan ravaged Russia in 1237, Slavic peoples had lived under the shadow of Mongol terror. Entire generations were born, lived, and died without knowing a single day of true freedom. After August 3rd, 1572, that shadow disappeared forever. Devlet attempted one last raid in 1573, but it was pathetic, barely 15,000 men. The Russians repelled them easily, without even needing the Goulier-Gorod. The Khan died in 1577, a broken man who'd seen his dream die in the fields of Molody. His successors never attempted another large-scale invasion. They simply lacked the capacity. Crimea's warrior elite had been annihilated. It would take generations to replace them, and by then, technology had irrevocably shifted in favor of states with firearms. Tatar raids continued, but they were small operations, basically banditry, not the apocalyptic invasions of the past. Russia built a line of fortifications along its southern border, turning the steppes into a militarized zone where Tatars could no longer operate freely. By 1783, Catherine the Great simply annexed Crimea to the Russian Empire. The wheel had turned completely. Descendants of the Mongol conquerors were now subjects of the empire they once dominated. But Molody did more than end the military threat. It freed Russian national energy for expansion. With the southern border finally secure, Ivan and his successors could look east. The conquest of Siberia accelerated dramatically after 1572. In less than a century, Russia would stretch from Poland to the Pacific Ocean, becoming the largest territorial empire the world had seen. Molody was in many ways the birth of Russia as a superpower. The country that had been trampled for centuries suddenly found itself free to pursue its own destiny. And that destiny proved imperial on a scale even Ivan could barely imagine. The mobile fortress that saved Russia at Molody deserves a place in military history alongside tanks, airplanes, and nuclear weapons. The Goulier-Gorod represented something revolutionary, the ability to combine movement with impenetrable defense. Before Molody, armies faced a fundamental problem. You could build massive fortifications that were practically unbeatable, but then you were stuck in one place. Or you could have a mobile army that could maneuver, but then you were vulnerable to attacks, especially against superior cavalry. The Goulier-Gorod broke that problem. Vorotinsky had created a fortress that could move where needed and then instantly become a powerful defensive position. It was the 16th century version of a tank, mobile protection combined with massive firepower. Modern military historians who've studied Molody are amazed at how advanced the concept was. 20th century tank forces operated under surprisingly similar principles: use mobility to reach a good position, then use protection and firepower to destroy the enemy. In 1570, a year before the Moscow disaster, Ivan had attacked Novgorod, killing between 3,000 and 60,000 of his own citizens based on unfounded suspicions of treason. In 1581, he killed his own son in a fit of rage. The dynasty he'd built almost died with him. When Ivan finally died in 1584, he left Russia in chaos. His surviving son, Fyodor, was mentally weak. The period that followed, called the Time of Troubles, almost destroyed the country Ivan had saved. Yet Russians never forgot Molody. Even during Ivan's worst excesses, chroniclers continued writing about the great victory. Because Ivan, with all his monstrous flaws, had achieved something no previous Russian ruler had managed. He'd completely freed Russia from the horde. If you made it this far, you're awesome. Hit that like button, subscribe for more incredible history stories, and let me know in the comments what other battles should I cover next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.